Most Souls-likes tend to differentiate themselves from Software games by giving us new mechanics. Lies of P, however, brings little to the table at first glance. Pretty much everything you can do mechanically in this game comes directly out of FromSoft games. It merges Sekiro's prosthetic system, parry and posture mechanics, with Bloodborne's fast-paced dash and healing systems, and the weapon art system from Dark Souls and Elden Ring. The areas too. In most Souls-likes, you can play for hours without ever thinking of From Software. In contrast, in Lies of P, you think about From Software quite a bit when you arrive at a new area and think, oh, it's Farron Keep, or Blighttown, or at pretty much any point in the first few hours of the game, oh look, it's Bloodborne. So a cheap Bloodborne knockoff then, Sekiro from Wish.com, Dark Souls at Home. Oh god no. To call Lies of P my favourite Souls-like doesn't really do it justice, as to me, this game is in a completely different league to any other Souls-like I've played. A league that was previously only occupied by From Software games. Despite the fact that Lies of P brings little new to the table and wears its inspiration firmly on its sleeve, I love it so much because it does exactly what From Software do. It delivers incredibly satisfying combat, a huge variety of well-designed enemies, exquisite bosses, phenomenal music, and a great world to go and explore. And it feels so unique because it manages to make all of these parts, which shouldn't necessarily fit together, as I'll go on to explain, work perfectly. All this being said, there is one big problem with Lies of P, and one that I fear may prevent some people from ever seeing how incredible this game is. So I want to deal with that first. Then I'm going to talk you through my first impressions of the game, covering these topics, and give you some tips along the way. Then at the end of the video, I want to cover some of my criticisms, along with some smaller issues I think could be addressed. I will be showing a lot of bosses from the game, but if you're avoiding spoilers, the audio to this video is completely spoiler free. So what's the big problem? Well, this game is hard. It's really hard. Lies of P is harder than any From Software game. And I know the second that I say that, a certain amount of you will say, well, I'm not buying that then. And to those people, I urge you to reconsider. Because this game is difficult in the same way that From Software games are difficult. You are going to get destroyed by a boss. But most of the time, you'll be so in awe of that boss, so captivated by the music and so satisfied when the combat begins to click, that the experience of the fights becomes worth the frustration of the difficulty. The late game of Lies of P is up there with the very best From Software games, and I promise you it's worth the investment of your time to get to it. The majority of the difficulty is overcome by getting good and learning the fights. However, there are a few small things that feel unnecessarily spiteful, and I'll talk about these at the end to reassure anyone who might be struggling. So first up, the mechanics and the combat. If any of you were around for the very early days of Elden Ring speculation, you may remember a general theory that Elden Ring would include the mechanics of Bloodborne, Sekiro and Dark Souls. And I remember being quite relieved when it turned out this wouldn't be the case. Because pairing Sekiro's mechanics with Dark Souls and Bloodborne's doesn't really work that well in theory. If you put a Dark Souls boss in Sekiro, it would get completely monstered. If you put a Sekiro boss in a Dark Souls game, it immediately becomes the hardest boss in the game. So having the ability to make a Sekiro-style deflect build in a Souls game would be completely overpowered and make every other build suboptimal. And I suspected that the same would be true for Lies of P. Parrying would be king, and you never need to use dodging. But that's not the case. While everything in the game can be parried, dodging is still incredibly effective, and to my surprise, sometimes felt superior in the mid to late game. Whether it is depends on both the boss you're fighting and the build and weapon that you're using. Check out this boss. Now, when I first walked in here, I thought I was in real trouble. Parrying this one felt really risky, and also a successful parry knocked me back out of his range, so I couldn't capitalise on the opening. I thought I was going to be here for hours. Until I realised that you can just dodge, and on certain attacks, plain walk around him like you're playing Dark Souls 2. And this gave me so many more attack opportunities. Dodging and strafing around his attacks meant that I could keep on the offensive all the time. Now check out this boss, who's one of the easier fights in the game. This combo is like 15 attacks long, and catching a couple of them will kill you. You can parry every attack if you like, or you can literally walk around the entire combo, dodging only the last couple of attacks, and then capitalising on the opening. All of this is with the standard dodge that you start the game with, by the way. You can upgrade your dodge using the unfortunately named P-Organ abilities, but I haven't tried that out yet. So this game isn't Sekiro 2 then, it's Bloodborne 2. Well, no, because say you were running a pure strength build and were able to deal all of the damage that you needed to during a single stagger opportunity, always being on the attack would be far less important. Or if you just wanted to be flashy and get better at the game, parrying would make a lot more sense. And this is what sets Lies of P apart, mechanically. For every single fight in this game, the Bloodborne approach works. The Sekiro approach works. Which one you take depends on your build, the boss you're fighting, and your preferred playstyle. And this can make for interesting choices and completely different feeling fights, all without ever changing your build or weapon. Another factor is how the stagger system works in Lies of P. Unlike Sekiro, an enemy won't immediately stagger once enough posture has built up. You have to hit them with a charged attack when their health bar starts glowing. And a top tip for Lies of P, don't try and force a chargey the second you see this. You have to wait for an opening. There is no hyper armor in this game, so you will be interrupted if the gap isn't big enough. I really like this choice as it forces you to learn the moveset well enough to know where your moments are for that chargey. Sometimes you just have to accept that there isn't room and miss the opportunity. And trust me, you'll die far less if you accept this rather than trying to force it. When the enemy does stagger, don't immediately take the riposte, because in this game, the staggers last for quite a while. This actually became a little mini game for me in trying to do as much damage as possible in a single stagger, by trying out different combinations of heavy, light attacks and fable arts. And a final tip for the combat mechanics: backstabs. They exist in Lies of P in exactly the same form as the Dark Souls games, and are super valuable for dealing with the humanoid fights that you're going to encounter. And by super valuable, I mean almost a cheat code for them. Next, let's talk about bosses. The bosses in Lies of P are excellent, and almost none of them would look out of place in a From Software game, which is as high as praise gets. Their animations and moveset work really well and look perfect. In a lot of other Souls-likes, there can be big issues with bosses, ranging from very wonky hitboxes to janky movesets that are very unintuitive to dodge or deflect. But these issues aren't present in Lies of P, for the most part. The difficulty of these boss encounters means that by the time you've beaten them, you likely have a very good grasp of their movesets, similar to playing Sekiro or doing low-level challenge runs in Souls games. This means that your second playthrough of Lies of P will be far less strenuous. The cinematics for the bosses are excellent too. Lies of P is chock full of ridiculously cool two-phase boss fights that are revealed to us in the traditional From Software way, by being just cool enough to distract us from the terrifying realization that there's another bloody health bar to deal with. Next up, mini-bosses. The mini-bosses in Lies of P don't have health bars, like the ones in Sekiro or Elden Ring, but they are very much deserving of them. I understand Neowiz's decision to not give them health bars, saving them from some of that "there's too many generic bosses" criticism that's sometimes levelled at Sekiro and Elden Ring. But I'm pointing this out so you don't feel too bad in getting stuck on them. There's definitely a few that took me many tries to beat. I'd say as a very general rule, the mini-bosses go down easier with a parrying approach, as they tend to be very fast compared to some of the larger main bosses. Next up, areas and level design. Now, the one downside to Lies of P that I don't think is a valid criticism is to do with its level design. This game is very linear. At no point was I lost or wondering which path to take. There is always a very clear progression path in each level, and I finished the game pretty sure that I'd seen and explored everything. This does feel a little disappointing when compared to From Software games. No alternate routes, optional bosses or secret areas to discover on subsequent playthroughs. But this isn't in my criticism section, because I don't think it's fair to criticise a deliberate decision in a game that does everything else so well. I'd much prefer a great linear game than a compromised semi-open one. The areas themselves are great, and there's excellent variety between them. I was a little worried this game might be a little too samey in levels, but there are actually so many different settings that all have their own personality and are really fun to explore. And like I mentioned, you'll notice plenty of subtle and not so subtle nods to From Software throughout. Weapons and builds. Now so far, I've only done one full playthrough where I made an advanced build and tried strength for a little while. I've also got halfway through the game on a more balanced build. But based on everything that I've seen so far, there seems to be a huge amount of build variety in this game. All of the weapons are super cool, and having that ability to switch the blade and handles allows for a whole lot of customization. And all of these possibilities are yet another way that Lies of P sets itself apart from Software games. Another thing that I found interesting is how most of the more powerful amulets in this game, think rings in Dark Souls or talismans in Elden Ring, weigh a whole lot. This meant I couldn't use them on my builds without being overweight or taking off some armor, which I really didn't want to do. So I do kind of wonder whether a capacity build would be a thing in this game, letting your special powerful amulets do the legwork on your damage instead of levels, while you wear the heaviest and most forgiving armor possible. Of all of the aspects of Lies of P, making some really silly builds is the thing that I'm most excited about. Now for enemy variety. And this one is always a little hard to measure. In an ideal world, we'd have every single area having bespoke, unique enemies with absolutely no repetition. But no game does that, not even FromSoft. I think what's important is not feeling like you're going through the whole game fighting the same enemies with different skins. And once again, Lies of P delivers on this, really rather well. Sure, there are early enemies that you'll see in slightly different forms all the way into the mid-game. But by the late game, the enemy assortments have almost no resemblance to what you see earlier on. They've done a really good job in distributing all of these different enemies throughout the areas and making them feel at home there. It's always a gripe of mine when you reach a cool new area that's so visually distinct from the rest, yet is populated by all the same dudes you've just been fighting in the last. Next, let's talk about the story and the lore. Now, this is always the thing that I tend to interact with the least in these games. Generally, my strat is go hit the big monster with a stick, wait a month for Vati to drop his lore video, and then say, yeah, I totally knew all of this, and that is why I hit the big monster with a stick. But in Lies of P, the story is a lot easier to digest than a From Software game. The lore, while not being anything like as deep or complex, is really cool. It's not constantly forced on you through endless cutscenes like other games, but also it's not as reliant on you seeking it out as a FromSoft game. Because of the relative narrowness of the lore, the temptation to interact with it at every opportunity was actually greater than usual. I found myself reading every article or note that I picked up, and in doing so throughout almost every area of the game, I always knew the name of, and some lore behind, the boss I'd be facing at the end, and this gave further weight to the big reveal. Throughout my playthrough, I felt myself genuinely caring about the characters, and when paired with this game's exquisite soundtrack, some of the late game story moments felt genuinely powerful, in a way that you'd expect more from a AAA Sony exclusive, rather than an indie Souls-like. Along the way, Lies of P subtly forces you to muse on what it is to be human. The dialogue choices you make as P, in contrast to the source material, present lying as a kindness, and telling the truth as the colder option. Both of these have noticeable consequences in your playthrough. Having tried one, I'm really looking forward to trying the other. And finally, for some criticisms of the game. Now, the first one is a very personal and subjective rant about a late game boss, so spoiler warning, and feel free to tell me to get good in the comment section. This fight is the worst boss fight in Lies of P, and the worst part of the game by a country mile if you ask me. It's not to do with difficulty. The boss doesn't make the top 3 hardest fights in the game. The hardest boss in Lies of P, which I've tried my best to avoid spoiling in this video, took me almost an entire day to beat, twice as much as any other, and I think that fight is absolutely perfect. I can't wait to do it again. This one, however, just feels a little unnecessary. It's annoying because by this point in the game, Neowiz have already proved that they can bring back previous bosses with new mechanics in an interesting way, and they've proved that they understand how to make a good multi-boss fight with the previous iteration of this one. And because of that, this boss ends up feeling unimaginative in a game that is dripping with imagination. I ended up using a summon for this one for the first and only time, such was my desire to have it over with. And the feeling when it was over was that of relief rather than satisfaction, which is always a sign that things have gone a little bit too far. I don't know what I'm suggesting here, and it might just be me, but a low in a game filled with so many highs felt worth mentioning. Next, field of view and camera centering. There's a few fights in Lies of P where you can get hit by attacks that you can't actually see the wind up of. The first example of this that I noticed was in the Archbishop Andreas boss fight. This descending attack he does in phase 2 completely leaves the screen before it hits you. For the second and probably the most egregious example, I'm going to show the final boss of the main game, so look away now if you're avoiding spoilers, and I'll say when I'm done. Once again, the overhead attack completely leaves the screen here, and in phase 2, if you're standing anywhere near it, the boss fully leaves the screen for this jumping red attack that has to be parried and deals massive damage. There were a couple of other examples of this throughout the game, but these were the ones that stuck out to me the most. All of these attacks can still be parried by learning the timing, but that's a little unintuitive if you can't actually see the attack you're trying to learn. I feel like these could be fixed by adjusting the field of view for these fights, or simply adjusting the position of the lock-on to the boss. Having it a bit higher on the boss would solve this, I think. Okay, I'm done spoiling now. Now for the big two, the only real criticisms I have of Lies of P. First, runbacks. There are two types of runback in Lies of P, and I've got an issue with both. The first is runbacks to main bosses. With the exception of one, these aren't dangerous and don't involve fighting any enemies. Which makes me wonder, what's the point of them? They don't take long, but when you're dying as often as you will do in this game, that extra 30 seconds of running back to the boss room really starts to grate. The second type of runbacks are the ones to mini-bosses. These tend to be slightly longer and generally do involve a bit of combat along the way. As I mentioned earlier, the mini-bosses in Lies of P are deadly fast and go from 0 to 100 a lot quicker than the main bosses. While you're getting used to their movesets, this can result in doing a 2-minute run to the boss room, battling through some standard enemies along the way, all to get killed in 10 seconds by the mini-boss. When you've been playing for 20 minutes and only have about a minute's worth of experience with the enemy that you're trying to learn, this can get a little annoying. And finally, for the big one. And rather than a direct criticism, this is a question that ties into the overall issue of the game's difficulty. In my review of the Lies of P demo earlier in the year, I said that the parry timing in this game was brutal and could be widened a little to make the game a little bit more accessible. When I was making my way through the early game of the full release though, I'd kinda changed my mind on that. Parrying isn't necessary, and if you widen that window to the size of Sekiro's, you risk upsetting that delicate balance between dodges and parries. Easy parrying would take away Lies of P's hybrid fighting style and turn it into pure Sekiro. It's fine as it is. Then, when I reached the late game of Lies of P, I changed my mind again and thought to myself that if they widened the parry window to twice what Sekiro's is, I still don't think it would help. Such is the ferociousness of the late game bosses. So should the parry window for Lies of P be widened? And is this game too hard? The honest answer? I don't know. As I sit writing this script, I'm doing so with Twitch open in another window, watching the wheels of the challenge run community start to turn on Lies of P. If this game stays in its current state, the speed runs, the low level runs, and the no-hit runs will be absolutely epic and possibly the pinnacle of Souls mastery. And I can't wait to see that. And I can't wait to continue my second playthrough and improve on all of the boss fights. Lies of P is currently a nirvana for Dark Souls nerds like me who want a decent challenge and don't mind putting in the time to achieve the satisfaction of becoming competent at it. But when I think of the care that Neowiz has put into this game, the storytelling, the lore, the boss design, the world design, the music, those incredible cinematic moments that are so impactful, I think this game deserves to be seen by everyone who likes good video games. And a lot of people will be put off by this difficulty. Do I love Lies of P as it is? Oh hell yeah, I adore it. Would I still love it if Neowiz dialed down some of the boss attacks from 11 to 10? Widened the parry window a little bit? And made it more approachable to a slightly wider audience? Also yes, because although I suspect that Lies of P's difficulty will be its biggest talking point, just like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, the difficulty of this game is the least remarkable thing about it. Thanks for watching.